Thank you for joining me today. Did you ever ask yourself, why am I here? One way to know the answer to that question is to look at how you got here. I was born in New Jersey in November of 1945. I grew up in the small town of Washington, not far from the Delaware River or Pennsylvania, foothills of the Pocono Mountains. A town of 5,000 with 3 traffic lights. That's just about the way it is today. My father ran a gas station. In those days it was a service station. He also had a milk route. He picked up milk cans from dairy farmers and hauled them to the processing plant in Port Murray. My mom worked as the office person for a small rock quarry in an even smaller town, Oxford, New Jersey. I had an older brother and a younger brother. We lived in a house with a coal furnace on a back street. My grandparents had a chicken farm in another small town, Belvedere, New Jersey. They had the largest corn crib in the county. The farm was run mostly by my uncle, and I spent a lot of my summers there. And we were members of the Methodist Church, and for a while, regular attendees. I even rang the church bells and belonged to the MYF when I was in my teenage years. I can still remember as a youngster playing the role of Pontius Pilate in a church play in the sanctuary. I had to be prompted to say the line, "I wash my hands of this evil deed." And I can't explain why I remember that. My dad for a while was on the church financial committee, but something happened and that ended his relationship with the church and with God. And it also ended our church attendance. Looking back on those times, I went away from the church and began crossing the line between good and evil. I have many things I have asked God to forgive me for. When I finished high school, I went to a technical college for a year and went on to work at Ingersoll Rand, making illustrations for their users' manuals. In those days, there were no computers to do that type of work, and all the illustrations had to be handcrafted. I was working at Ingersoll Rand during the time of the Vietnam War, and I was made exempt from the military draft. But I was looking for something, but I just didn't know what. So without consulting my parents, I enlisted in the Air Force at age 18. It was somewhere around this time that my mother called me the prodigal son. At the time, I didn't know what that meant, but this is where God intervened in my life, and I didn't know it. After taking the entrance tests, I told them I wanted to be a jet engine mechanic and signed up for that. But when I enlisted, the Air Force was short of electronic technicians. So the recruiter changed my enlistment and sent me off. A change that would affect the rest of my life. I went off to an engineering school in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. And when I graduated, I was stationed in Peshawar, Pakistan. There for almost a year and a half. While I was there, I saw a lot of third world life, and even a Russian air show. This is the room I had to stay in there with 2 other people. This was the transportation to and from town. They're called tungas, they're horse-drawn carts. And this was a local meat market, and you can see the meat hanging there outside. When I came back to the States, I was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And once again, God intervened in my life, but I didn't know it. Some of the civilians I was working with worked part-time at a TV station that was going up in Springfield, Ohio. They brought me along and I helped with the electronic installations. And eventually, when my enlistment was up, I was hired by the TV station, where my wife-to-be was working as a receptionist, scheduler, and lots of other duties. It was a great time in my life. I did everything from directing Bozo the Clown shows local news shows, Jerry Lewis muscular dystrophy telethons. But eventually the TV station went bankrupt, and I moved on to work in a motorcycle shop in a little town called Xenia, Ohio, a town that would be devastated in 1974 by an F5 tornado. But I wasn't at work when it happened. Well, my friends at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, who put me into the TV business, helped me get a job as an electronic technician with a government contractor that supplied technical services to the division where they worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I worked there for 10 plus years, and there were many changes in my life. I was married and had a son and daughter. I realized that I would need an education if I wanted to earn more money. So while I worked full-time, I also went full-time to Clark Technical College for 2 years and earned an associate degree in electrical engineering. The thing was, though, I had become addicted to going to school and learning. So I transferred to Wright State University and began taking 2 courses a quarter. Eventually, I earned a bachelor's degree in computer engineering over the next 6 years. Now, while I was doing all of this, I worked on some of the most rewarding advanced government projects at the time. One of them was to do the proof of concept work for guided bombs, which have now been long in military use. The way the guided bomb works is there's a video camera in the front of the bomb. When it's released from the aircraft, the co-pilot in the back seat guides the bomb in on the target by viewing the video from the camera. In the meantime, the pilot turns the plane and flies it away from the target area. Now, in those days, we didn't have very sophisticated computers to do this kind of work like we would today. We had to do all the work with an IBM 360 computer that was programmed by punched cards. The electronics part that generated the display for the people to look at to see if this was going to work also had to be hand-built. We used students from the University of Dayton to determine that they could actually fly these bombs in and make contact with the targets. I also did some early development work for the drones that are now commonplace today. At one point, we built a radio-controlled airplane that was about this size. It was powered by an engine from a chainsaw. We put a camera in the front, and it was radio-controlled, and we had it actually flown by pilots sitting in little trailers on a runway where they could take it off and fly it. I also designed and built a unit that went on the space shuttle to help relieve nausea that the astronauts were suffering from. One other thing I did that was interesting was I developed a covert landing system. The way this worked was we had 2 guys jump out of an airplane with these little landing lights strapped to them. They could only be visible through night vision goggles, which were also being just developed at the time. But they'd set one up here and one up there. The C-130 that dropped them out would then fly around and come back and use those invisible lights to the naked eye to land the airplane in the landing zone. And when we went over to try it out in South Carolina one night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was standing at this end. The pilot was coming with his C-130 in blackout mode, which means you cannot see them. They also have a silent mode, which means you cannot hear them. So as I was standing there, I couldn't see the plane coming, I couldn't hear the plane coming, but when he went over my head, I could feel the vortex from the wingtips. It was really neat. Another program I worked on that had quite an effect on my life had to do with the American hostages that were taken from our embassy in Iran in 1979. There was a first rescue attempt for them under Jimmy Carter that resulted in a failure. But most people don't know is that there was a second attempt that was underway that I was a part of. And while I was doing this work, once again, God intervened in my life, but I didn't know it. The hostages were released when President Reagan took office, and that ended our effort. But during that time, I traveled to Marietta to work for a couple of weeks at Dobbins Air Force Base. Now, the weather in Ohio in February is cold and gray and rainy. But in Marietta, it was warm, trees were blooming, people were running around wearing short-sleeved shirts. So when I went home, I told my wife we were moving. So in 1983, I got a job at Georgia Tech on their research faculty. So we moved to Georgia and lived in Kennesaw. After going to Tech for 1 year, working there, I was no longer able to tolerate working directly for the government. They have no deadlines, which is the way I need to work. So I found work as a field application engineer for NEC Semiconductor. And God would use this job as a way to raise his voice to me. But once again, I would not hear him. I will detail that a little bit later. And when we moved to Georgia, my wife worked for Bell South Mobility. That was when the cell phone industry was in its infancy. She was employee number 60. She had a good job that she liked well and was well compensated. And that left me the opportunity to go to work for a number of startup companies in the semiconductor business. Now, over the next 20 years, I would work for 9 different companies and travel all over the world. During this time, we bought a pontoon boat. And we really enjoyed it on Lake Allatoona. Enough so that we wanted to find some lakeside property, but found little to choose from on Lake Allatoona. So we started to look around West Point Lake. We bought a 1-acre lot and built a house there and moved there full-time around 1994. We had a lot of fun at that house. Grandkids would come for the summer, Christmas celebrations. But eventually, we decided to look for some property with a little more room and ended up buying some acreage on Hammett Road that turned out to be close to Dean and Nancy Larson, whom we did not know at the time. That was around 2001. But there was another important event that took place in that time. Our grandson Tony, that many of you know, was born in 2003, but he needed a place to live, so he stayed with us for the first 5 years of his life. During that time, God was busy in our life, but we still didn't recognize it. My wife Pat enrolled Tony in the FUMC preschool program. He loved going there. And Pat also began to take Tony to Morning Glory when Quincy Brown was the preacher. Now, one day when Pat and I were taking a morning walk, she told me Tony didn't want to go to church anymore unless I went. Now, Pat didn't quote the scripture exactly, but she made the point that a little child shall lead them. Once again, God was intervening in my life, but this time I was listening. So I started to attend Morning Glory and for the first time began to understand the presence of God in my life. Eventually, Pat and I would join the church and our relationship with God would grow. The prodigal son was back. Since we have joined the church, we have taken part in many church activities. We joined the adult fellowship school class. I became part of the Methodist men's group. And I joined a Friday morning Bible study group that meets at Chick-fil-A. And one thing I started to do was to look back on my life and try to identify the times God was intervening in it. Here's a few of the significant things he did for me that affected my life. In 1949, when I was 4 years old and too young to remember, the family dog woke up everybody at 1:48 in the morning because the house was on fire, saving all our lives. In 1965, that Air Force recruiter changing my career field without asking me, which impacted everything that happened to me since then. In 1981, when I lived in Ohio, and my grandmother that lived in Belvedere on the farm was ill. God sent me a vision early on a Saturday morning of me standing by her as she was lying in the bed with a white sheet over her. My mom called me a few hours later to tell me that she had passed away. In 1986, when I was working for NEC Electronics, I was traveling with one of the marketing guys from California, making customer visits. He was an older German immigrant, Al Rickman. And as our trip was ending, and we were on a plane flying back to Atlanta, he asked me, "Do you believe in God?" Now, he had never mentioned anything religious to me before in all of our travels. I answered him by saying, "No, I don't believe in God." He replied to me, "You will." And then he pushed his seat back and went to sleep. I never saw him again, but when I look back on that moment, I know that was God reaching out to me. Even though I wasn't listening, God never gave up on me. Now, there have been 3 fairly recent incidents in my life that I should not have survived, but I did. In 2010, I was mowing one of the pastures with a rebuilt 1950 Ford tractor that I had bought. The tractor stalled, and I got off to take a look at the engine. And what I discovered was the metal tubing running from the gas tank down to the carburetor was glowing red hot. I turned and ran away as fast as I could. And after it cooled down, I discovered that the man who rebuilt the tractor didn't ground the gas tank. So all the electrical was running through that tubing that was carrying the gas. So I asked myself, instead of stalling, why didn't the tractor blow up and take my life? Also in 2010, when I took my routine annual physical checkup, my doctor recommended to me, even though I was feeling fine, that I go over to Roanoke Hospital because they had a special on running heart calcium tests, which is a way of evaluating the arteries around your heart. So I took the test, and I got a call while I was traveling in Kansas and was told to get home immediately. It seems my calcium score was off the charts, and I was susceptible to a heart attack known as the widowmaker. A few weeks later, I would have 2 stents put into arteries around my heart that were 60 to 80% blocked. What is unusual about this is a few weeks after the test, the Roanoke Hospital closed its doors. And by the way, the doctor I go to was recommended to me by Dr. Factor, one of the Friday morning Bible study members. Now, in June of 2011, we were visiting my brother's family in Pennsylvania. My younger brother has always been into building and racing cars. And I was riding with him in this replica of a 1932 Roadster he built. And the night before, he had just added a windshield to it. And we were traveling down the road at a pretty good clip. And all of a sudden, the windshield glass blew off. I can't explain why or how, but I reacted by reaching up and catching that windshield in my hands as it flew toward us. Instead of cutting off my hands or even beheading my brother and I, once again I have to ask, why didn't this incident take my life? God was watching out for me and clearly had something planned for me. Now, since I joined the church, God has found ways to work through me. In 2013, my wife and I were returning from a Christmas visit with our son's family in Ohio. We like listening to radio classics on satellite radio, and that was when I first heard the radio show, The Greatest Story Ever Told. They were playing Christmas episodes, and I thought, wouldn't it be really neat if we could put something like that on at the church? So I did a little research and came up with a CD with the programs, several of the programs on it, about 30 episodes. I transcribed the episode that I thought reflected my life, the lost coin. Then I sat on the script for a while, not knowing how to move forward. But one day I watched some kids put on a Christmas play at Morning Glory, and I realized if they can do that, surely I can put on a play. So we went ahead and put on the first radio show. And one of the amazing things that happened was that we were 2 weeks away from the performance, and I still had no way of creating the sound effects. Once again, the Lord intervened, and I found a terrific program for free that let me create and play the sound effects as you hear them during the shows we put on. I've also had the opportunity to teach a few Sunday school lessons, and recently I had a part in the Living Last Supper program, which I had never even heard of. What's strange about it is that I was called on a Thursday night and asked if I could replace someone who was dropping out, and I would have to be ready to perform the following Wednesday. I'd never even heard of this program, but I agreed to try and do it. The interesting thing about this is that role I had to learn. I didn't get a passive role like Thomas or Philip or James. I was Simon the Zealot. But I think the message that Simon had to deliver was meant for me, more so than the audience. Here's the key part of the message Simon delivers. So I have given him my highest loyalty and deepest devotion. I have, in military parlance, unconditionally and completely surrendered myself to him. To think his thoughts, to love as he loves and whom he loves, to obey as he obeys, and to serve as he serves. This surrender has not imprisoned me. Rather, it has set me free for the first time in my life. And one of the other things God has done for me since I joined the church was to provide me with shepherds to help me grow in my faith. People like John Huckstep, Ray Newman, Dean Larson, the men at the Bible study. They all have helped me to grow in my faith through understanding the Bible, teaching me how to pray, how to listen, and how to serve others. And Dean also put me on to Dr. David Jeremiah. I now faithfully watch his sermons, and I've read most of his books. I've also shared many of his episodes and lessons with my Sunday school class, as he has a unique way of making Bible books such as Revelations more understandable and meaningful. Now, I used to wonder if becoming a Christian this late in my life would affect God's acceptance of me. But when we were studying the parables of Jesus at our Friday morning get-togethers, my question was answered by this parable in Matthew. The parable of the workers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them on into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day, doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were first hired, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said. And you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. And he answered them, I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. And the landowner, whose decision to pay all the workers the same was an act of mercy, not injustice. It represents God, whose grace and mercy are shed abundantly upon those of his choosing. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. It does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. Whether God calls someone early or late in life to partake of his grace, the glory and praise of our salvation is his and his alone, and in no way amounts to unfairness. Just as the landowner has the right to do what he wishes with his own money, so does God have the right to have mercy on whom he will have mercy. There are a few verses in Psalm 16 that describe my life as I know it. Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. I will praise the Lord who counsels me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. I keep my eyes always on the Lord, with him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Oops. Here's another example of God communicating with me. As I was crossing the creek at my house at Easter time in 2013, I spotted this cross that had been formed naturally in the woods. A few weeks later, it was no longer there, but it served as a reminder to me of the sacrifice that Christ has made for me, and that the sins of my life have been forgiven. So let's go back to the original question. Why am I here? It took me 60 years to realize that God has been guiding me throughout my entire life and to become a Christian. Over the last 10 years, I have grown in my faith to the Lord and in my thankfulness to Jesus for the sacrifice he has made for me. The reason that I am here, my purpose in life now, is to serve others. I do my best to recognize the opportunities to serve that God gives me, and I try to meet those needs in a way that reflects the goodness of his heart. I want to close with a few lines from one of David Jeremiah's daily devotionals. Ask God today to give you a servant's humble heart. Look for an opportunity today to humble yourself and serve another person. As God has been a blessing to you, pass it forward, being a blessing to someone else today. Amen.